He's like, "Are you sure?" And I was like, and I was giving him the bus route to get to my house.
Oh,
And that's all I knew, and it was
yeah.
longer, right?
Yeah.
So, social work allows us to see all these different parts and developmentally, from a child's age, that child grows up. How
Hmm.
does one start adapting or not adapting to maturing? So, social work, I think, is really helpful, as at least components of it, for every field to have some awareness of how the bigger systems um, are at play. So, what are we talking about when we talk about systems?
Right, right. I'm with you on we need to be everywhere. I just sat with that, like we need to be in all of these different places to just really, like you said, right? Like noticing the gaps in the systems. Um, but would you say, so what are we talking about when we're talking about systems?
Yeah, the system.
Lord,
There's so
what are
many.
I know. I'm like, what are you trying to unpack here? But as you're talking and thinking about systems, what I'm thinking about too is just like the history of social work and the importance of just people of color entering this field. Because there are systems that are built and a lot of times without us being in mind, right? They're not thinking about um, the BIPOC experience. So when they're creating systems, whether that's school systems, the educational systems, the hospital system, all these different kind of systems, they're not thinking about the little girl who struggles to get to school and has
Yeah.
to take 2 buses, right? They're not thinking about these things. They're thinking about more privileged people. Oh, you can just hop in a car and go to school. It's no big deal,
Mm-hmm.
right? Um, and it is interesting because we know that we don't enter, even though we create everything. I'm going to just say that we create everything. We don't enter spaces until long after it's been created,
Right.
right? So once it's formalized, it's like, okay, y'all had a great idea. Now that y'all gave them this idea, we're going to take it and run and y'all can go somewhere. Um, so for the longest time, social work was a thing. I think it started in 1888. And it was more of a profession. It became
Yeah.
a profession in 1898, but we didn't enter the field until more of the civil rights movement,
Mm-hmm.
to really be able to have a voice for our community and to really think about how to support people of color within systems, school systems, healthcare systems that weren't built for them. Um,
Yeah, I believe the foundation, and that's what you're talking about. The foundation of the social work field is really important for us to understand and be critical of. Now that it's been around for a very long time. We're talking about late 18, early 1900s, and it's accredited to Jane Addams having started the field. We now know that she was very critical of Black women voting and having rights.
mm-hmm.
So here's this social worker who's helping people, but doesn't believe all people um, were of value. And so but I'm always mindful about who are the social workers. Traditionally, we have known them, and even still, a large part of the social work field is comprised of women, 80%
Yeah.
women,
Mm-hmm.
and nearly 60% of them are white women. I'm sorry, are white people. And so with 19% of men, followed by about 20% of Black folks, and that's a mix of men and women. So there's still a huge disparity around who the helpers are and who they're helping,
Mm-hmm.
and to be mindful about our own biases and our own histories around those people who need help.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, because biases definitely play a role. And sometimes, if you don't have the lived experience or been a part of certain communities, it does create a barrier to supporting individuals, right? So, having the history of social work be predominantly white definitely can impact our communities in a way that is unhelpful, whether it's intentional or not. The impact is still that it is not helpful. And sometimes that can create traumatic experiences for
Right.
our community because some things are just not understood.
Right. And I think we see that, and it's been depicted in movies with families, right? If there's a parent who's struggling with drug addiction or homelessness, um, that the room for error, the room for
Mm-hmm.
any kind of hardship is much smaller for a person of color than it is for a white person
Right.
experiencing similar
Yeah,
hardships. And we've
exactly.
seen how, like in the CPS, Child Protective Services, where there's been a lot of disrupted families or children removed from families at a greater rate than white counterparts. But that's not all what social workers do. You know,
Mm-hmm.
that's a part of it for the vulnerable population of children who have parents who cannot provide safety and
Mm-hmm.
basic needs that are necessary for that child's well-being. And I'm being very careful about those words because there are families who are dealing with homelessness and drug addiction who are caring for their children and they're not at risk and at harm.
Yeah,
Um, you know, that's a truth too. And,
exactly.
you
Yeah,
know,
that's
we,
real. And I think what you're speaking to is like these biases, right? Based on um, judgment. Like you have judgment of somebody based on what you see and you act accordingly.
yeah,
And we can even see it in the therapeutic space, right? Where these biases happen not only in adoption or in TPS, but in therapeutic spaces where you have somebody who doesn't fully understand the culture,
right.
making judgments, right?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, we can, I think there have been times, I can only speak anecdotally, where in Black communities or certain communities we're very spiritual, so some people have the gift of speaking to spirits or hearing spirit speaks to them,
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
right? And sometimes that's labeled as psychotic, and it's not. Maybe it is, but maybe it's not.
No, it's not. Mm-hmm.
So really doing deeper assessment or getting to know the culture
Mm-hmm.
is really important because it can be a traumatic experience. Now you got this person hospitalized or whatever the case may be because the culture is not understood
Right.
or medic.
Paranoia. Well, people are looking at me or they're following. Well, that is a common experience for some people when you're in a store shopping that people are looking at you or they are they are in fact following you.
Yes.
Um, so there's a bigger context that I think the field has now become more. It is becoming more diverse, but the numbers still are not reflective of who are the helpers. And so um, there's been a history of social workers being traumatic to people, even though we're supposed to be helpful. So that's a real truth that we have to be humble about when we are in this servicing field, that people will have their reservations because their words have been twisted or they haven't been fully understood. And so even the folks who are needing help will decline it or push it away or not be resistant
Mm-hmm.
because they've had someone tell on them, report them for something that was not even
Yeah.
egregious or of concern.
Yeah.
But there's now, more talks about a decolonized approach, a more culturally humble approach to social work. And I believe our white counterparts should and can learn
Yeah.
these tools as well, because they're still in the role and it's
Mm-hmm.
still helpful.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. They're still in their majority of the role at this point. So it is helpful and it's also necessary
Yeah.
that we have these conversations because a lot of the people who are vulnerable happen to be a part of the BIPOC community.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so having the education, the awareness, and the cultural humility is necessary.
Yeah. So you might see social workers involved in a lot of these social injustice issues, these headliner things that people are seeing in the news, with children, with people with disabilities, people who are experiencing poverty and homelessness, medical patients, LGBTQ, folks suffering from addiction, even students. You know, we're
Mm-hmm.
seeing a lot of laws change around students, and they're being impacted by some policy changes. Folks with mental health issues, refugees and immigrants, aging people, folks who are getting older, our elders and seniors in the community are considered vulnerable.
Yeah.
Sometimes couples and families.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's not just one; it's a whole group of people who need to be wrapped up in some support. Victims of violence and trauma, folks who are incarcerated or dealing with the criminal justice system, and veterans. These are typically the groups of people, which is a lot. You
Yeah.
know, some people may belong to multiple identities or multiple groups. And so they're considered even more vulnerable because they have
Mm-hmm.
more barriers or more ways that folks can be, um,
The intersections.
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
be at risk.
Yeah, for sure. And what I hear you saying when you talk about like policies and laws is, empowering or giving a voice to the communities who may feel like they don't have a voice, right? And that's a lot of what we do is empower people. We use our voice um,
Mm-hmm.
to encourage them to use their voice, and sometimes they can't. So then we have to step up to the plate and show up and show out and
Yeah,
use our voice for people who need this kind of support.
yeah. That
Yeah.
we're good little researchers, right?
Mhm.
Knocking on all the doors, but we're also brokers. And that's one way that I like to look at it, is that I can be the mediator between you two until you two can connect and have a plan to move forward. And sometimes people need help with that. They've been insecure, or they've been hurt or damaged and resistant. That a broker can help you, lead you to the next step.
Yeah.
And that's our goal, is that folks are getting closer and closer to getting their needs met, because we know the journey is like all over the place.
Yeah.
It is not um, a linear process, and there's a lot of silos and gaps that people fall into. Do you want to talk a little bit about the scope of social work, like the levels, micro, meso, macro? Because that's what we're always thinking about. Like,
Yeah. We can get into it a little bit. So yeah, so for micro, it would be kind of like what we do in our individual practice, right? So we see one-on-one clients, or even if you're a social worker out in the community, you do case management, that would still be like micro level work. And then meso would look like, it could look like a family system. And I think meso could even look like maybe even couples. It's just more than one person, like small groups, small community work. And then macro would be more policy.
yeah,
Right?
yeah,
So, and we're across the micro, meso, and macro levels. You'll see licensed clinical social workers. We're everywhere in these streets. Okay.
well, we get excited when we see each other, because we're not
Mhm.
always invited to the table.
No.
Even in the field of like healthcare, Kaiser did a major study that showed that it's actually social determinant. There's social factors that determine your health. And
Mm,
there's not a lot of social workers leading those charges and interventions. It's mostly like doctors and nurses, which is okay. But it makes me curious, why aren't there more social workers involved in impacting health related concerns?
yeah. Yeah.
Seeing social issues as a health issue.
And I mean, it makes sense, right? Because we know just from a human standpoint, we need social interaction, like social connection. All of these kinds of things impact our wellness overall,
Right.
right?
Even the
And
Surgeon General is talking about loneliness as being a major issue in the United States. The word loneliness, that is social work written all over it, where we
yes,
can rebuild community that has been disrupted by COVID-19, been disrupted by the social injustice issues and all these other things that we're seeing. There's all these extreme occurrences, and now folks don't know how to connect.
reconnect. Yep. No, that was a big thing. I remember, I want to say maybe it was 2021 because 2020 was just like a blur. But
Right.
2021, I got an influx of clients who were really fearful of being in large crowds and like being back in community. Like that transition back into community was really scary.
Yeah.
So when I hear you saying like the impacts of COVID-19 and the loneliness and the isolation and all of this information pushing people to socially isolate, which we understand the reasons for that. But also in those conversations, I don't think social workers were in that room because when I was seeing things unfold, I had concerns. I'm like, well, so like isolation, you're talking about depression, you're talking about not being connected to